Well, I want to thank everybody for attending. As I mentioned Wednesday, this is our last guest speaker celebrating Black History Month. So I can't think of a better way to end Black History Month with Dr. Turley. Her bio does not do justice. I know you've heard me say that before about other speakers, but once you hear Dr. Turley speak, you'll understand where I'm coming from. Dr. Turley will, well, I'm excited the potential of her continuing her relationship at Marietta College. And I don't want to ruin anything, but I'm hoping to announce that to everyone soon. But what I'm going to do is start out introducing Dr. Turley, then I will let her take it over. Question and answer, feel free to ask questions if you would unmute when you ask a question, of course. And Dr. Turley, like myself, like to see pictures. They like to see, she likes to see cameras. And I'm sure she's old school like me. So if you want to turn on camera, that's fine. We don't mind that you're eating if you are eating, but we would like to see you at some point as well. All right. Dr. Turley is well versed in African American and Appalachian history. She is a former professor in the African American Studies, Appalachian Studies at Marietta College, University of Louisville, and Georgetown College. She is also the founding director of the Berea College Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education. She's a founding director of the Georgetown College Underground Railroad Research Institute and a founding member of the National Park Service Underground Railroad Network, the Freedom Review and Advisory Committee. Dr. Turley has also lectured throughout the country on topics related to African American history. She is currently the Freedom Stories Project Director with the International Storytelling Center. And today, in addition to Dr. Turley speaking about Marietta's history regarding the Underground Railroad, she will also share her experiences serving as the director of the Freedom Stories, Unearthing Black Heritage of Appalachia. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Turley.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to speak about Marietta, Ohio, a place that we probably don't focus enough attention. I know sometimes in modern times, we often overlook our beginnings, our roots. We don't quite understand how we came to be the location that we are now. And I would certainly say that's true about Marietta. So today's conversation, we're going to focus on the importance of Marietta as it relates to the Underground Railroad and a great many other American reform movements, which Marietta was key in promoting, mainly because of its religious growth, the people who lived there as they came over the Appalachian Mountains and settled along this river community of Marietta. So we're going to start just by talking about the founding of Marietta, which was in 1788 by General Putnam, which I'm sure is still a very popular Marietta, Ohio name, or at least I hope so. And it was the first permanent settlement of the Northwest Territory. And hopefully everybody understands the Northwest Territory and the 5 states that came out of that territory that really created the freedom land for escaping enslaved African Americans. So it was part of Washington County. And of course, Washington County was named after George Washington, America's first president. And as people moved over the mountains following the American Revolutionary War and settling along the river in Washington County, they brought with them a certain set of beliefs that did not believe in slavery. It believed that if you were going to have a true democracy, that you must have universal public education. They believed that alcohol and drinking dulled the mind and retarded social growth. And so they were big supporters of the temperance movement. And they also were the first community in the Northwest Territory to promote the idea of private land ownership, meaning it's not a land of barons. You don't have to inherit property because you're heir to someone with money, but anyone who could provide the funds could actually purchase their own property. So an area was a Northwest Territory, was a huge area of which 5 states were created. And before the Revolutionary War, it had been claimed primarily by Native Americans. And so beginning in the Northwest Territory, reformers had a different idea about how American society should look. So it developed its own system of community organizing, which meant, as I said before, anyone could own land if they could purchase it. There was no need to have slavery in a land that promoted concepts of freedom and humanity and equality. Therefore, they prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. And they established universal public education, meaning you don't have to be the son or daughter of a wealthy landowner in order to receive an education. They made land available to those Indians that remained in the Northwest Territory, which were primarily Cherokee and Delaware, by giving them 10,000 acres on the river where they were attended to by Moravians and Methodists and other religious leaders who were given the task of civilizing, and I use that term in quotes, the Native Americans and promoting Christianity among Native American populations. So written into this new Northwest Territory in 1785 was the belief that education was essential to a democracy. So every new township had to require acreage set aside for schools, public schools. So every community was given the responsibility of creating, number one, a school, building a school, and number two, bringing in teachers who were with the idea that religion and morality are all connected to this idea of good government, and the happiness of mankind relied upon people being well educated. So the ordinance divided the territory. Every 36 miles, townships were created, and that lot number 16 in every one of these townships had, which kind of puts in the middle of each township so that everyone would have access to the school. Every township would have a public school. So this is how the Northwest Territory developed. Along with these many reforms came in Washington Township, which basically became the feeder community for the development of the Northwest Territory, including establishing the territory's first post office. So mail delivery and all those things were central to Marietta. But along with that came the idea of, you're right across the river from a slaveholding state, West Virginia, Kentucky, both slaveholding territories. So a lot of these reformers also became reliable Underground Railroad conductors and educators and civil liberties champions. And that's the history. They were like, if you can make it to Marietta, we welcome you. And we also believe that we can educate you and make your life better in this new Northwest Territory. So Muskingum River served as a major byway for these escaping slaves, especially out of West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky into the United States. And after, of course, 1854, with passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, that territory became a little less safe and people continued their trips into Canada. But for quite a while, they were fairly safe in this Northwest Territory corridor. So I use the word North American freedom in quotes because, as we know, after 1854, even these Northwest territories are not really safe. And so this is when you begin to see folks moving north as slave catchers began to move into these Northwest communities, realizing there's a great deal of money to be made from just stationing yourself along these escape routes and returning slaves and collecting money. Many times they're even returning African Americans who had gained their freedom. It didn't matter, as long as the skin passed the test, you could be sold into slavery, whether you were free or an escaping slave. So prior to the beginning of the Civil War, these black dots represent the large communities of slaveholding populations. And as you can see, it's butting right up against Southern Ohio and West Virginia, where enslaved African Americans were finding freedom along the Appalachian Mountain Trail. You can see that corridor along the Appalachian Trail, which housed many enslaved African Americans. In 1994, William Jefferson Clinton, then President of the United States, authorized a study of the Underground Railroad as a national initiative. So this assignment was given to the Department of the Interior, National Park Service, and they conducted about a 4-year study trying to accurately document corridors of freedom that served as part of what Larry Guerra termed the Liberty Line. And those of you who were not familiar with Larry Guerra, he was a Quaker, but also one of the foremost scholars in bringing the Underground Railroad story to life for future scholars. He was one of my early folks that I read that got me very interested in Underground Railroad history. So the National Park Service defined the Underground Railroad as the ability to assist persons held in bondage in North America to escape from slavery. Very simple. It recognized the height of the activity from 1820 to 1865, and it defined it as America's first interracial civil rights movement. Now, we talk about 1820 and 1865, but you should understand that slaves were escaping beginning in 1619. You know, when slaves first reached the continent, they immediately began to find their freedom, many of them finding freedom in the mountains of Appalachia, where for a long time they were extremely safe. So you do have little enclaves of freedom in the mountains that are secure for many years before this push of abolitionism. So when the National Park Service identified 3 routes that they categorized as nationally recognized escape corridors. And the first corridor was the Eastern Corridor, which of course is the Eastern Seaboard, which was characterized by escapes into the Atlantic Ocean that went from New England into Canada. The Central Corridor along the Appalachian Trail into Canada, and the Western Corridor, which traveled along the Ohio, Mississippi rivers, and many times headed into Indian territories, the West and Mexico. So that route was identified because it was well documented. They could find resources that could support operators along that path and escape stories that use these corridors. So if you're looking at that study, it will give you many resources and why their reasoning for why these routes were developed. The Underground Railroad system comes about because in the 1820s and 30s, you have the growth of the American rail system, which of course, African Americans are very intricate agents in building these railways. But the language of trains becomes easily associated with an Underground Railroad secretive system of escape. So agents are really considered to be ticket sellers. Those people who know about the routes, those people who can basically provide information. They may not necessarily be people who hide you, but they can certainly share, if you want your escape, this is where you must go, this is who you must see, this is where you buy your ticket. And so the station masters are actually those who would permit their homes or their businesses or their farms to serve as stops along the Underground Railroad, where you could stay, be fortified, change clothes, whatever's necessary to move you along the tracks of freedom. And the conductors were those who were actually brave enough to I'm sorry, that should be run the train, not rein the train, but who ran the train for escaping slaves, meaning like a Harriet Tubman. They would go into communities, pick up passengers, and take them to these stations. And the boarding call was knowing the right language, the right symbols, the right music that would let you know a conductor was somewhere near you or in your community. And so you could contact that person or that location if you wanted to buy a ticket to board the train. Reasons for running away, of course, could be many and varied, but many of them centered around this idea of being sold south, which I know in Kentucky was a major threat for enslaved African Americans who were thought to be misbehaving, to be sold south, because to be sold south means that you would traditionally be worked to death life expectancy for a slave sold south was roughly 7 years after sale. So usually you're working in sugar plantations, cotton plantations until you die, because it was much cheaper to work you around the clock, uh, very little nourishment, cheaper to buy a new slave and replace than to try and sustain a long life of Southern slaves. So fear of sale, you knew your life was very limited. Many times people escape trying to find family. They escape once they realize families are going to be divided by a slave sale, or they've been threatened with severe punishment. And when I say severe punishment, we often think that lashing is severe, which usually could be the average whipping could be anywhere between 39, 50 lashes, which is almost whipping you to death. But also there was such things as hobbling, where if you were a constant person who tried to escape, basically your foot would be cut in half, so you really couldn't run. Our personal desire for freedom. You just decide that my life, I'd rather risk it trying to find freedom than to remain enslaved. So advertising, much of our history, much of the history the National Park Service has used in developing these corridors has to do with ads. Escaping slaves were tremendous profit loss, money loss. So just about every newspaper in the county or in the country had runaway slave ads. And they gave a great, if you look at old newspapers, they give you a great deal of information about the escaping slave, the owner, where the slave is possibly thought to be running away to. So these slave ads become a tremendous source of information. I don't want you to think that African Americans made their escape by any means necessary. So there's not one way that you decide to make your escape, whether it's on foot. And of course, we have this little gentleman in the corner with the knapsack on his back. That became one of the markers that most newspapers used when they were listing runaway slaves. If you're on a river, riverboats, trains, false bottom wagons, stagecoaches, some people like Henry Box Brown, who boxed himself up and mailed himself to an abolitionist community in Philadelphia. So whatever means became available for you to make your escape, that's what was employed. So based on the National Park Service study of 1994, these routes were developed to indicate where slaves were escaping from and where many of them ended up. And we focus a lot on Canada, but really we have just as much or a little less focus on the Caribbean, which many slaves escaped from. If you're in Georgia or Florida or Texas, it's more intelligent for you to try to make your way to Mexico or the Caribbean than to try to fight your way through slave territory into Canada. So we've paid less attention to the Texas-Mexico border, which had several Black enclaves of escaped slaves from Kentucky or from the South in general, or the Caribbean, where many slaves made their way to freedom in Cuba and other island communities. But today, with a focus on Marietta, we're going to talk about one of the most famous and first, in my opinion, trails into freedom was the Appalachian Trail, which made up both the central and eastern path of freedom because of its inaccessibility. I mean, many people find it difficult today to traverse the Appalachian Trail. So it was a wonderful place to make your way to freedom. It had a pathway all the way from Alabama into Canada. It's French speaking as well as English speaking Canada. So it was one of America's earliest escape routes. A major Appalachian escape route, of course, is one that runs right through the community, which is the Kanawha River Valley, that empties into Southern Ohio communities that became, and it also, this shaded area, the highlighted area, is also an area of industrial slavery. So most of the slaves who used this river escape were also engaged in the industries of iron ore mining, forestry, saltpeter mining. So you had a lot of companies that used enslaved labor in this particular section of um, uh, American economy that's really booming now, beginning with the salt industry. So many slaves use this river escape, and it empties right into Southern Ohio, Marietta, all along that border with West Virginia, and escapes from Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. This puts it a little bit better. Wilbur H. Siebert's work, The Underground Railroad in 1889, really did a great job of highlighting the Northwest Territory, most popularly used Northwest Territory escape routes. And I've tried to circle where Marietta shows up down here in Washington County with Quaker communities and anti-slavery communities all along the route. Marietta had several ways of escape, of course, out of Washington County, but some of the most heavily supported and used went through Mount Pleasant, up through Hudson, which of course, if you know anything about John Brown, this is his community. So there was a great deal of support along this route. And folks who took this route were generally on their way to Canada. Many of the Ohio routes went west into territory that was still owned by Spain and French held territories west into California. But in this early period, beginning in the late 1700s, this is a very well-traveled route out of Appalachia into freedom in Canada. So Marietta Abolitionism, Marietta Weekly News was one of the papers that really was considered a reformist newspaper there in Marietta, talks about the appearing of reformers in the area and their work in working with runaway slaves from Parkersburg. So that's a focus on West Virginia, which makes sense because coming out of the mountains into the rivers that lead directly into Ohio was a popular escape route. So in that early newspaper, there are articles that talk about those who were helping escaping slaves. So Marietta, this is Henry Burke, who was a good friend, and we worked together for many years on documenting Underground Railroad locations, particularly in Southern Ohio. This is one of the popular escape routes, and you see here in the corner the sections that it encompassed. So you have the route that comes out of Proctorville, Ohio River, Ironton, all along the river, that leads through Mount Pleasant. We're going to talk a little bit about Mount Pleasant and why that was such a popular escape route, but clearly coming through Marietta into some of the other Eastern Ohio escape corridors. And I was happy to see that you do have a marker. So if you're exploring Marietta, this marker is a great reference point as to where some of these early reformers dwelled. So in 1819, there was an abolitionist in Marietta, James Lawton, who wrote a poem for Marietta, encouraging all of the escaping slaves to make Marietta their home, to find freedom there in Marietta, where no mourning slave the passing stranger meets. Blessed be thy name, while fair Ohio waves shall part thy borders from the land of slaves. So this idea of Marietta being this welcoming place of freedom on behalf of those who could find rest within the community of Marietta. And we have no stories that talk about any slave being returned from Marietta by slave catchers once reaching Marietta. So apparently they had a very successful capturing and protecting of runaways. The Marietta Weekly Leader talks about, again, Belpaire and Parkersburg, West Virginia, and all those extensions along the way that helped slaves along the Underground Railway. They openly express their support and talk about the main stem of the railway, which came through Marietta. So we have very little doubt of Marietta's importance in this Underground Railroad saga. from the words of those who actually participated. An abolitionist that was part of the Marietta community, which was a great hero of mine, Theodore Weld, who was married to Angelina Grimke. And if you know of the Grimke sisters out of South Carolina, this is Theodore, one of the husbands of the husband, not one, just the husband of Angela Grimke. And he was a very outspoken professor. He taught at Lane Seminary. And of course, those are the people of Lane who departed to form Oberlin College there in Ohio. He was an agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he organized most of the anti-slavery societies in Ohio. He was the architect of the American abolitionist movement beginning in the 1830s and 1844 when he led the Lane rebels out of Lane Seminary. He was a writer, editor, speaker, organizer. So he's written and published books, and
you need most of Claudius guys to.
Is that a question or was that? Okay, I'm gonna.
I think they forgot to mute them. I muted it for him, Dr. Turley.
Oh, okay, all right. So the co-author of books, so you can read about Theodore. He's very, and this is of course a photo of him when he's a young firebrand and breathing abolitionist fury versus a very elderly Theodore Weld, who continued to be a reformer throughout his life. And then, of course, Reverend John Brown, who Hudson, Ohio, which is in Summit County, he's the major Appalachian. He does it all. He's a conductor, he's an agent, he's a station master. He totally hates the concept of enslavement. Of course, he leads people from Summit County to Kansas, where he's trying to prevent Kansas from entering the Union as a slaveholding state. And he does all of this right from Ohio, where he actually brings almost the entire community of Hudson from Hudson to Kansas, where he attempts to stop the incorporation of Kansas as a state, as a slaveholding state. And I love this image of him because you can just see the look on his face, and he's holding a flag which we've not been able to really describe. But when we talk about codes and symbols, we believe John Brown's flag was one of those major flags that let you know an abolitionist community was near. Much of Brown's work was financed by the Secret Six, and these were men from New England who funded much of Brown's work in Ohio and in Appalachia. These are names you may have heard: Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who also became a Union military leader in the Union Army, Gridley Howe, for all of these, Theodore Parker, Franklin Benjamin Sanborn. If you've read a Sanborn map, then you know this name. Gerrit Smith, who was one at that time, he was America's richest man, who spent much of his money in creating the Liberty Party and other groups, and Luther Stearns. So these men financed much of the abolitionist community. Benjamin Lundy, who is probably one of the better known Quakers in Eastern Ohio. He's from Mount Pleasant, Ohio. His home is still a historic landmark there in Mount Pleasant. Worked a great deal with abolitionists in Marietta to aid and to establish these escape routes when they were first being created. He was both, like John Brown, an agent, a station master, a conductor. So he did it all. He actually went into the South to aid escaping slaves. And it's very seldom that you find these Quakers who actually take on this role of doing it all, using his home as a location, actually going into the South to aid. This is a picture of Lundy's Mount Pleasant home, which I have to say was in pretty bad shape. I hope over the years, it has a marker. The state of Ohio has recognized it as a historic structure. I don't know how much is going into protecting it, but he's out of West Virginia. He's a newspaper editor and publisher, Sadler, and he goes not only in Ohio to establish anti-slavery societies, but also does it in Missouri and Tennessee. And in Tennessee, he worked with the Quakers, Elihu and Thomas Embry. That's a father and son team, and other East Tennessee Quakers. And Professor Mile mentioned my work with the International Storytelling Center. Jonesboro, Tennessee is the home of Elihu Embry and those early Quakers, where the Storytelling Center is located. Samuel Doak and other anti-slavery Presbyterians who came out of that area really fed the development of anti-slavery advocates who ended up in Ohio in the Northwest Territory. So James Davis is one of those freed slaves who ends up in the Northwest Territory in Marietta, which at that time was called Harmar. And Marietta he was a conductor. He was one of those people who actually traveled from Marietta into the slaveholding South, performing often. He'd be hired as a violinist on the riverboats. He would do these things that would allow him entry into white society, and then perfectly use that opportunity to aid slaves reaching freedom to Marietta. He was the first president of the American Sons of Protection, which was predominantly a Black benevolent society that had roots in slaveholding South, a secret society. He was also a Wesleyan Methodist. So James Davis, we have very little information on him. So if anyone is interested, I'd love to know more about James Davis. But Frances Dana Barker Gage, who is a Marietta abolitionist that we do know a little more about, she was primarily a women's rights activist. Many women became involved in the American abolitionist movement because they saw themselves as sharing, in many ways, the same restrictions of enslaved African Americans. So many of them got involved in the anti-slavery movement with the hope that if they could free the slaves, they could also gain more rights for women. And so as a recognized leader of Marietta's women's rights movement, she was also friends to major figures, Clara Barton, Sojourner Truth. She in fact prints Sojourner Truth's speech at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention, which was held in Akron, Ohio. And she also became an employee of the Western Sanitary District during the Civil War. Western Sanitary District is important because they're the ones who began to provide medical care for United States colored troops. This was something, even though you could enlist in the military for the first time as a fighting soldier, there was very limited care given to Black soldiers who were wounded during the Civil War. So she worked to set up care for United States colored troops. And more importantly, at the end of the Civil War, she became the supervisor of the schools in Penn Center in South Carolina, where enslaved African Americans were given an education. Another major Marietta, the Putnam name, of course, should be familiar with you as a founder of Marietta, is Rufus Putnam, who founded Marietta, David Putnam Jr., who goes on to become one of the most noted Underground Railroad conductors. He's several cases, federal cases, where he's brought to trial for aiding slave escapes. He's defended in most of these cases by who became a Supreme Court Justice, Salmon P. Chase. And Chase would win these court battles for him, and then he would immediately go back to rescuing slaves. And this is a photograph of his home, which I understand no longer exists there in Marietta. It was torn down during the 1950s, but certainly one of Marietta's better known abolitionists. And then a young woman that I have written about a little bit, Charlotte Scott, who was also there in Marietta. She came to Marietta when her owner, Meg Scott, who came out of Virginia, married a physician, Dr. William Rucker, and brought Charlotte with her to the marriage. Charlotte was given as a wedding gift to Meg Scott, Margaret Scott. And then upon marriage, one of the conditions that Dr. Rucker placed was that Marietta must be given her freedom, which he did free her upon their marriage. when he became the official owner of Charlotte. And Charlotte remained with the family, caring for the family until she died. But she's the woman who began to collect funds upon the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. She was so moved by Lincoln's move to free the slaves that she began a one-woman campaign to collect funds to create Freedom's Memorial, which is a national monument in Washington, D.C., which is there today. And it was placed at the site of the Black Hospital. So if you visit Washington, D.C. to see this monument, you're also visiting the site of the first African-American hospital established by the Union Army to treat Black soldiers. It was separate from white soldiers' encampment, but it also had America's first licensed doctors, African-American doctors. That hospital morphed into what we now know as Howard University in Washington, D.C. And so this is the monument. Maybe you've seen it. And it is unfortunately one of those monuments that about a year or so ago, people were saying needed to be removed. So one of the questions that I wrote an editorial piece for this, but I really don't think this is one of the monuments that need to be removed. First of all, it's the nation's first national monument paid for solely by African Americans. So African Americans raised money for this monument. They through the Western Sanitary Commission, who became the body that collected funds to create this monument. And they also approved its form, meaning many people are offended by it, and I'd like to hear other people's opinions on it, but they're offended by the memorial because they say it shows a Black man on his knees. Now, when I look at the monument, I don't quite see that, but I know I'm looking from a different perspective. I'm looking at a man, by the way, this man's name, that he's from Missouri. He's an escaped slave. His family is from Western Kentucky, Archer Alexander. So he is an actual escaped slave. He is considered the last escaped slave in America from St. Louis, Missouri. And so his image was selected to be the person rising to his feet. He's broken the chains of slavery. His eyes are not fixed on Lincoln. His eyes are fixed on the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln is holding in his hand. And he's rising to his feet to accept the benefits of freedom. So this is, unfortunately, I don't think this interpretation goes along with the monument, so people may not have a clear understanding of what this monument represents. They feel it gives too much credit to Lincoln and not enough to Archer Alexander, which I will agree, that I think we should know more about Archer than we do about Lincoln, but that's just the impact of African Americans not knowing our history and us not telling a complete American story. So with that, I'm going to stop. I feel like I've been talking forever, and ask if there are any questions. And I really would like to hear if you think this memorial should stay or should go.
Everyone, feel free to unmute, ask questions, or you can type them in the chat if you're really shy, and I can read your question for you.
I'll ask a question. So you talked about the boarding calls where there's specific language, writing, or some symbols or anything else that would help people in the town know that that's a conductor. Do you have any examples or stories that you could share with us about some of those?
About the coded language?
Yeah. Any examples of that? Yeah.
Well, certainly there's a couple of books that have been written. There's one that's written by a good friend of mine. He's a Howard University professor who's no longer with us, that wrote a book called Hidden in Plain View. I think if you could read his book, he took a great deal of flack about writing that book, but since his death, it's been uncovered that many slaves who worked, especially in South Carolina and North Carolina mills, that fabric mills that created a cloth that we all, and that's still the case today, that many times these symbols that African Americans would weave these into patterns that became known to particular, it was a way of communication that they could preserve their history by trying to remember things that had been passed on to them from their African heritage. So those symbols may not have been meant to be codes, but became recognized symbols of culture that people attach to a particular way of thinking or a particular enslaved population. Harriet Tubman gets credit. She was illiterate, she could not read, but she was known for her singing voice. And of course, many of her songs, the way she would let people know she was in the community is she would sing a song, Steal Away. That's considered a religious, both a religious song, but also one of her ways of letting folks know she was in the neighborhood. And then Wade in the Water. That's been pretty much considered now a song developed by white abolitionists out of Ohio, really. So I would say, yes, if you look online and if you look at some of the scholars who have done work on this coded language, you can find those things. Robard, Jason what is his name? I'm sorry, I'll look while we're talking. But if you look up the title, Hidden in Plain View, that will give you some hints as to other books and titles that you could read more about this.
Thank you.
And Rob, did you bring up that question related? What was Wade in the Water, one of the songs we heard at the Compass of Freedom at the escape room? One of the clues?
Yeah, I don't think it was that one. What was it? I can't remember. I think, oh yeah, it was like, it said like, let our people go. I can't remember. Go down Moses. Go down Moses. Go down Moses.
Go down Moses. And that was a reference, Harriet Tubman was referred to as the Moses of her people. So Go Down Moses is really a reflection on Harriet Tubman. Go down, and by the way, the term Moses did not just refer, Moses was the name given to any conductor. They called themselves Moses. So it's a biblical reference that African Americans would have been familiar with because of course they had all been Christianized to the Gospels, but Go Down Moses could be anyone who's an actual conductor. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And Dr. Turley, wasn't the Ohio River referred to as the River Jordan?
The River Jordan, I'm sorry, say that again, Tony.
Wasn't the Ohio River referred to as the River Jordan?
Yes, the River Jordan is the Ohio River. And keep in mind on the Ohio River, even that song, there's a song about abolition, people dressed in white, all of these are reference to, the color codes are references to people who are on the other side of the Ohio River who were there to assist, many times to rescue people from the rivers, especially along the Ripley, Ohio, Marietta, Ohio, coming out of the Ironton into those well-traveled locations. Good questions.
Anyone else have any questions?
I wanted to comment on the question about Freedom's Memorial. I wouldn't go so far as to say whether I think it should be taken down, but it was interesting hearing the description because when I look at it, I sort of see the benevolent white man standing over the black man, the escaped slave, and his posture, Lincoln's posture suggests, again, that benevolence that he's rescuing him. But again, it puts the focus more on Lincoln. And just comparing that, I had the opportunity in the fall to visit Old Town Alexandria and the Contrabands Freedmen's Cemetery and that memorial, and contrasting this to that statue, that sculpture, and the Path to Freedom in Sandusky. They're just such, the difference is very striking, and certainly they're intended to memorialize different things, different aspects of the path to freedom, to steal that phrase. But I just found it, it's just such a striking difference, like I said, with the white man standing over the black freedman.
Right. And the sculptor of this monument admitted freely that he was attempting to honor Lincoln. He was in mourning after Lincoln's assassination, and really had begun to craft this monument in Europe after hearing about the assassination. So the monument went under significant alterations because the African-American community was like, okay, because Alexander wasn't even in there. And so the idea of including a true story, which Archer Alexander's story had made national press. And so they incorporated, working from photographs that had been sent to him by the Western Sanitary Commission out of St. Louis, he crafted this image of Archer. So he admits that he was honoring Lincoln. He was devastated by Lincoln's assassination. So this is where you see Lincoln receiving such prominence over Archer Alexander. And I understand what you're saying. This is exactly the complaint people have about the monument. And my attachment to it isn't so much because of Lincoln or Archer, really. For me, it's about the idea that African Americans, United States colored troops, raised the money for it and pick the location for it. And if you do replace it, what are you replacing it with? Right now, this monument occupies important Washington, D.C. real estate, which you probably would never be able to get that real estate back. And to create this monument is probably going to be much, much more than what was paid for initially. So I have mixed emotions about whether it should go, or maybe we should explain it better. I don't know. I hate to see it leave because it's so hard for African Americans to get this sort of national placement in our history.
Dr.
Thank
Turley,
you.
Dr.
Yes.
Turley, are you aware if Marietta had any monuments or dedications to Charlotte Scott?
Not that I'm aware of.
And like a next project, Rob?
Well, Charlotte Scott, because she's just, she can't even read. She actually goes to Rucker, who is the one who aids her in setting up this fund in order to collect money to create this monument. So going back to the agency of one person and how one person, as unimportant as she probably saw herself, how she went about creating this national monument. And of course, by appealing to the United States colored troops to help her raise money, the United States colored troops raised the largest amount of money for the creation of this monument. But they also campaigned around the country to gain money in support of Charlotte Scott. So she was very clever in how she went about creating this fund and finding the people to help support her and to get the monument made.
And Dr. Turley, I was going to mention earlier, you mentioned a Mr. Davis, and I apologize, I forget his first name.
James Davis.
Now, I'm wondering, and probably the Davis name is pretty big at the time, but if you're familiar, I'm sure you are, at the Legacy Museum, which Rob and myself and some college members are going there here in a few weeks. They have the lynching of Christopher Davis, which is from Athens County. In 1881, he was murdered, actually from Albany. Dr. Turley, I'm sure you know that Albany was a primarily Black community at the time. The Albany Enterprise Institute existed there, but he was lynched. So I'm wondering if there's any connection with Christopher Davis and him.
Wow. I don't know. James Davis was the first free Black man in the Northwest Territory, and he was there in Marietta. So that would be a tremendous story if we could find out his wife and family and lineage. I have no doubt that he remained a reformer throughout his life. And there's very little, I've not been able to find a great deal of information about James Davis. It's been very sketchy.
Perhaps that's some research you and I can do.
That'd be wonderful.
Any other questions or comments? I wanted to tell everybody too, you heard Rob and I talking earlier about the Compass of Freedom escape room. If any of you are interested, our office still wants to connect with the Multicultural Genealogical Center out of Chester Hill. We visited a few weeks ago. It's a Saturday event. If you never visited an escape room, it's fascinating, yet a little bit terrifying because, particularly in this case, it puts you in the body of that freedom seeker. And the freedom seeker in this case, her name is Jane. And I mentioned it Wednesday, if some of you are on a presentation by Linda Showalter. I'm not familiar if it's a Jane from the late Henry Burke's book, The Escape of Jane, or the Jane that Linda was referring to, but you will put yourself in that freedom seeker's body, and you will discover the clues that conductor left you, as well as she left you, to solve the puzzle to get out of this escape room. It's fairly cheap. I think the agency which I'm a member of, the agency should be charging more. It's only $10 per ticket. And if you're interested, Rob and I can correspond and have you visit the Quaker House, which, as Dr. Turley mentioned, the Quakers were quite involved in the Underground Railroad and abolitionism. And we can dress appropriately, but we can visit Hammond's Cave, is actually Underground Railroad location in Chester Hill, Ohio, too. So we can make a day out of it, and then we could go eat as well. So any of you are interested, let me know. Rob and I can correspond, and they would love, it's a nonprofit, they would love the additional funds. They put a lot of work into this escape room.
Yeah, escape room, scary thought, but okay. and those Gist settlements, I'm worried, has Marietta done any research or have any documentation of those early Gist settlements that are created in Southern Ohio beginning in the late 1790s?
Are you referring to Black settlements, or?
They are Christopher Gist, who moves out of Virginia and frees his slaves in Southern Ohio. He buys land and relocates them to Southern Ohio. And I don't know if that's how James Davis got there. I have no idea. But he created a series of settlements in Southern Ohio for his freed slaves. He gave them their freedom, bought them land, and set them up across the Ohio River. A lot of these early Gist settlement folks are the ones responsible for many of these escape quarters that we're talking about now. So I know of the Gist settlements. I don't know of any major work that's been done on documenting these early settlements, which surely must have included Marietta.
This is the first I've heard about that, so I would love to hear more and research more.
G-I-S-T, Gist, Christopher Gist. And they were called Gist settlements. And I don't know how many there were, but I do know that in addition to his own slaves, several people who thought as he did, that slaves should be freed, repatriated their slaves to these settlements. So I would just be curious about what documentation, if any, you would be able to find on that.
Well, I will find out if there are special archives, special collections rather, if we have any in the Marietta area. You said G-I-F-T?
G-I-S-T.
S-T, okay. And fact, much as I have heard you talk many times, I learn something new every single time. Any other questions or comments? Now, somebody mentioned in the chat about this being shared in local school systems. As you know, Ohio is not one of those states would as of yet to talk about history. No, I don't like the term CRT as history. Rob and I are actually going to be visiting Morgan County school systems Morgan County Junior High next Monday to talk about Black history in the area in Southeast Ohio. So we would encourage those of you who have connections with the local school system, we would encourage you to talk to them, principals, superintendents, to not just Black history, but discuss Native American history, connect the Marietta, Washington County, as well as women's history. We have to educate. If we don't educate, we're going to lose the history, the knowledge, and the wisdom.
Tony,
Yes.
this is Jill Torbett. That's interesting. You're going to go talk to a school system because in Marietta, they used to be involved with History Day, which started in Ohio. Our daughter she competed 3 times in that. Our son, I think once or twice. It used to be a requirement in 8th grade. But these subjects would be really fascinating for anybody that still is involved in History Day. Marietta City School District, as far as I know, is not. I think our daughter was the last one, only one, for a couple of years, actually. So if you're going to be talking to a school system in the area, these topics are really, really fascinating.
Well, it's interesting, Jill, you bring that up. I was talking to, I'm sorry, Dr. Turley, taking up your time. I get off tangents sometimes.
No.
I
I'm
was
listening.
talking to a Belpre High School teacher a couple weeks ago about the possibility that he teaches history or social studies, about coming there to present on Black history amongst other cultural months. And I mentioned the advantages of educating to decrease unconscious biases and so on and so forth. He, as a white male, he didn't feel like it was necessary. He said Belpre didn't have any history related to that. So I reminded him about a year ago, so you remember, and it made local news that there was 2 students from Belpre High School that were in Parkersburg Mall dressed up in Nazi uniforms. So in fact, that education is needed, even if he didn't view that the education was needed. So, and this education history, and be knowledgeable about the rich history in the area. Dr. Turley and I were talking earlier, if some of the family names in Southeast Ohio was researched deep, they would realize that a lot of their ancestors assisted with the Underground Railroad. Is recorded in Wilbur Siebert's index, his information, making those family ties. So I see we have some people leaving, Dr. Turley, so I know it's their lunch hour. I appreciate all of you for attending. Again, Dr. Turley is helping our office and continue to help our office educate everyone in the community and college and local community. But Dr. Turley, I can't thank you enough for that.
Yeah, I'm hoping that our viewers and listeners will take it as a mission to uncover this wonderful early Marietta history. Where you may find yourself now is not how you began. So it would be wonderful to go back and look at this early reform history and the role it played not only for Marietta, but the country, especially as it relates to education as an important way of socializing the world. So those are my parting words, and that's my mission to you.
Well, it'd be interesting, Dr. Turley, if we could utilize you a little more in regard to educating even our alum the importance of Marietta College when it comes to this rich history of Marietta College and the local community. So that's just an off thought. I'm sorry. Without further ado, I'd like to end, and everyone please thank Dr. Turley for her presentation. Again, we're going to be working with her, knock on wood, a lot more in the future. So all of you will be excited to find out the news eventually. But I'd like to end this presentation, excellent presentation, with a quote from Dr. John Henry Clark. I quoted Marcus Garvey Wednesday with Linda Showalter in regards to history. So this is John Henry Clark. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on a map of human geography. History tells the people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most importantly, history tells the people where they still must go, what they still must be. The relationship of history to the people is the same as the relationship of a mother to her child. So we have to pass on history. We have to continue to educate. With that, I would like to thank all of you for attending. If you have want any information, Dr. Turley, what somebody did mention about possibility of sharing your PowerPoint, if you would consider that. Because some came in late and they wanted to look back.
Well, so how are you, Tony, going to share this conversation? I would like for them, if they don't want to just look at the slides, I want them to hear.
It is being
our-
recorded now, and I will be stopping here in a few seconds. And Rob, my new coordinator of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, will share this on our YouTube page, and we can actually send out links, or you can simply look up Marietta Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Correct, Rob?
Okay, then I'm happy with that. So.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day. Monica, good to see you again.